In ancient Rome, history was not written for everyone. Some lives were carved into marble. Others disappeared without a name. This is the story of one of those lives. Not of an empress, not of a poet, not of a woman history chose to remember, but of a girl born into a world that never asked who she wanted to become. In ancient Rome, being born female was not a tragedy. It was a condition shaped by law, tradition, and power. From the moment a girl was born, her body, her future, and her silence were already claimed. She belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and finally to the expectations of a society that measured her worth in obedience and fertility. She would not vote. She would not rule. She would rarely speak, at least not in ways that history preserved. And yet she lived. She learned. She endured. She carried the weight of family honor, lineage, and survival on her shoulders, often without leaving a single trace behind. This video is not about exceptions. It is about the ordinary, about what it meant to grow up as a girl in a civilization that defined greatness through men and stability through women's silence. To understand Rome, we must understand her, the daughter, the wife, the mother, the invisible foundation of an empire. This is the story of a fate written before birth, and of the lives history almost forgot. In ancient Rome, birth was not a celebration. It was an evaluation. When a child entered the world, the question was not, is the baby healthy? It was, is this child worth keeping? For a girl, the answer was uncertain from the very first moment. Roman society was built on hierarchy, of class, of citizenship, of gender, and gender came early, long before education, before marriage, before law. A girl learned her place simply by being born. Childbirth in ancient Rome was dangerous. There was no medical science as we understand it today. Midwives relied on experience, herbal remedies, and prayer. Many women died giving birth. Many infants did not survive their first days. The room where a child was born was filled with tension, not only because of pain or fear, but because of judgment. After birth, the newborn was placed on the ground. She did not yet belong to the family. Under Roman custom, the child became a legal member of the household only if the father chose to accept her. This ritual, sometimes called tollere liberum, to lift the child, was a moment of absolute power. If the father lifted the baby, she lived. If he turned away, she did not. This decision was legal. It was social. It was normal. And girls were rejected far more often than boys. The practice of abandoning unwanted infants was known as exposure. Babies could be left at crossroads, on hillsides, near temples, or on garbage heaps. Some were taken in by others and raised as slaves. Some were trafficked, many died. A girl could be healthy, strong, and still be exposed. Her fate depended on calculation. Was the family wealthy enough to provide a dowry? Did they already have too many daughters? Was a male heir still needed? A girl represented expense, not continuation. If she was accepted, she entered a world ruled by one man, her father. Roman law granted the paterfamilias complete authority over his household. His power, patria potestas, extended over his wife, his children, and his slaves. For a daughter, this meant she owned nothing. She could inherit nothing independently. She could not choose her future. Her body and her life were subject to another's will. Even her name reflected this reality. Roman girls were rarely given personal names. Instead, they received the feminine version of their father's family name. If his name was Cornelius, she was Cornelia. If there were multiple daughters, they were simply distinguished by age or number. Identity was not encouraged. Individuality was unnecessary. From infancy, a Roman girl was prepared for one purpose, marriage. But before marriage came survival. Infant mortality was high for all children, but girls faced an additional burden, neglect. Boys were prioritized in food, care, and medical attention. A girl who cried too much or seemed weak might simply be allowed to fade away. This was not always cruelty. Often it was economics. Rome was an empire built on practicality. Compassion was secondary to structure. Yet within this harsh reality, girls lived. They grew, they adapted. They learned the sounds of the household, the rhythms of labor, the expectations placed upon them long before they could speak. Their earliest lessons were not taught with words. They were taught through silence, through observation, through the understanding that their lives, though real, were never meant to be central. By the time a Roman girl took her first steps, her path was already narrowing. She had survived birth, but her fate had only just begun. In ancient Rome, power did not belong to the state. It began at home. At the center of every Roman household stood one figure, the paterfamilias, the father. His authority was not symbolic. It was legal, social, and absolute. This power was known as patria potestas. For a Roman daughter, this meant that from the moment she was accepted at birth, her life was no longer her own. The law recognized her father as the owner of her existence. He controlled her labor, her marriage, her property, and her body. He could decide where she lived, whom she married, and when she left the household. In early Roman law, his authority went even further. A father could sell his children into slavery. He could disown them. He could order their punishment, and in extreme cases, he could order their death. These rights were rarely exercised in their most brutal forms, but their existence shaped everything. A daughter grew up knowing that obedience was not a virtue. It was a requirement for survival. Unlike sons, a daughter would never escape this authority through age or achievement. Even as an adult, she remained legally dependent, first on her father, then on her husband, and sometimes back again on her father if she was divorced or widowed. Freedom was never assumed. A Roman girl learned early that her role was not to decide, but to comply. This power extended deeply into marriage. Her father arranged her match. He negotiated the dowry. He weighed political alliances, social status, and family advantage. Love was irrelevant. Desire was irrelevant. Consent was optional. A girl could be promised in marriage while still a child. When the time came, she was transferred, not as a person, but as responsibility. The language of Roman law makes this clear. Marriage was not a union between two equals. It was a movement of control. In some forms of marriage, a woman passed entirely from the authority of her father into that of her husband. In others, she remained legally tied to her father, even while living with another man. Either way, she was always under someone's power. The father's control also shaped her education, or the lack of it. A daughter was taught what her father deemed appropriate. For most, this meant domestic skills: spinning, weaving, managing servants, maintaining the household. Intellectual education was limited and practical. Knowledge was acceptable only if it made her a better wife. Too much learning was dangerous. Too much independence was suspicious. A quiet daughter reflected well on her father. A visible one did not. Even her emotions were regulated. Roman culture valued female modesty above all else. A girl was expected to lower her eyes, control her speech, and suppress anger or desire. Public visibility was discouraged. Silence was praised. A well-raised daughter was one who was barely noticed, and yet the father's power was not always exercised with cruelty. Many fathers cared deeply for their daughters. Some protected them, some educated them, some delayed marriage. But even kindness existed within a system that denied autonomy. A girl could be loved without being free. This was the paradox of Roman womanhood: affection without agency, protection without choice. By the time a Roman girl reached adolescence, she had already learned the most important lesson of her society. Power did not belong to her. It moved above her, around her, through her, and one day it would be transferred again, from father to husband, In ancient Rome, a name was not a gift, it was a classification. For a Roman girl, naming did not mark individuality, it erased it. Unlike boys, who received a praenomen, nomen, and sometimes a cognomen, girls were rarely granted personal names. Most were simply given the feminine form of their father's family name. If her father belonged to the gens Julius, she was Julia. If he was Cornelius, she was Cornelia. If there were several daughters, they were distinguished not by personality or identity, but by order, major, minor, or numbers. This was not accidental. A Roman girl was not expected to represent herself. She represented her family. Her early years were spent almost entirely within the household. Public life belonged to men. The streets, the forum, and political spaces were not hers. Her world was enclosed. As an infant, she was cared for primarily by women, her mother, female relatives, servants, or enslaved wet nurses. Upper-class families often employed wet nurses so that the mother could become pregnant again quickly. Motherhood was not only emotional, it was strategic. Survival in infancy was uncertain. Disease, malnutrition, and poor sanitation claimed many lives. Children died regularly, and this loss was expected. But for girls, survival required more than physical strength. They were often weaned earlier than boys. They were sometimes fed less. Medical attention, when available, prioritized male children. The reasons were not personal, they were structural. A boy was seen as continuity, a future citizen, heir and carrier of the family name. A girl was temporary. She would leave the household through marriage. Investment in her was measured, yet despite neglect, many girls survived. They learned to walk on stone floors, to recognize voices, to observe silently. They absorbed the hierarchy of the household without being taught. They watched how men spoke and were listened to, and how women spoke and were ignored. By early childhood, a Roman girl understood power long before she understood language. Her clothing reflected her status and expectations. Simple tunics for daily life, practical and modest. Bright colors and decoration were limited. Excess attention to appearance was discouraged. Beauty was valued, but only later and only for marriage. As she grew, her world narrowed further. Boys began to move outward, to tutors, to public spaces, to learning. Girls remained inside. Their lessons were repetitive, embodied, and silent. Spinning wool, folding fabric, cleaning and organizing. These tasks were not menial. They were symbolic. Roman culture idealized the woman at the loom, disciplined, productive, unseen. From infancy, a girl was trained for invisibility. She was not encouraged to speak loudly, not encouraged to argue, not encouraged to ask questions. Curiosity was tolerated in boys. In girls, it was corrected. By the age of 7, a Roman girl had already internalized her future. She would belong to a household, not her own. She would serve a lineage, not herself. She would be remembered, if at all, only in relation to others. And still, she lived. She laughed. She played. She formed attachments. But history did not record these moments. What survived were expectations. And as childhood faded, something else approached. The transformation of her body into property, puberty, marriage, and the end of innocence that Rome never recognized as hers to begin with. In ancient Rome, a girl did not disappear suddenly. She faded. There was no single moment when her voice was taken away, no official declaration of silence. Instead, invisibility was learned gradually, through correction, through repetition, through expectation. As a Roman girl grew older, the boundaries around her tightened. Her body began to matter in new ways, not to her, but to others. Movement became restricted. Running, shouting, physical freedom, these belonged to childhood, and childhood was ending. Modesty replaced play. Control replaced curiosity. A girl was taught how to sit, how to walk, how to lower her gaze, not because it was natural, but because it was required. Her presence in public space became increasingly limited. The streets of Rome were not designed for female independence. A respectable girl was not meant to wander alone, to linger, or to be noticed. Visibility invited judgment, and judgment threatened family honor. Roman society placed enormous importance on pudicitia, female modesty. It was not simply a moral quality, it was a social currency. A girl's reputation belonged not to her, but to her father's household. Any perceived impropriety, a rumor, a glance, a whispered accusation, could damage her value as a future wife. So she was protected by restriction. Silence became a form of safety. Education, when it existed, narrowed rather than expanded. Some girls from elite families learned to read and write, often at home. They might study basic literature or music. But education was never meant to empower. It was meant to polish. A girl was educated enough to be pleasing, not enough to be independent. Too much intelligence was unsettling. Too much confidence was inappropriate. Roman writers praised women who spoke little and listened much. A virtuous woman was one whose words were rare. The ideal daughter was one who blended into the household, efficient, obedient, unseen. As she matured, her clothing changed. The tunic lengthened. Fabrics became heavier, more concealing. Her appearance was regulated not to express herself, but to signal virtue. Adornment was carefully balanced. Beauty was encouraged, but not individuality. Too much ornament suggested vanity. Too little suggested neglect. Even her body language was controlled. She learned to take up less space. Conversations increasingly happened around her rather than with her. Decisions were discussed in rooms she did not enter. Plans were made for her future without her presence. Marriage negotiations might already be underway. She was becoming an object of exchange. And yet she understood more than anyone admitted. She observed power from the margins. She learned to read tone, silence, and implication. In a world where speech was denied, perception became a skill. Invisibility did not mean ignorance, but it came at a cost. A Roman girl learned to separate her inner life from her outer role. Thoughts remained unspoken. Desires remained unnamed. Fear remained private. This internal division was not accidental. It was how Rome functioned. Empires are built not only by armies, but by people who accept limits placed upon them. By the time a Roman girl approached puberty, she was already trained. Trained to obey, trained to endure, trained to disappear, and soon her body would mark the final transition. From daughter to bride. In ancient Rome, education was not a right. It was a privilege and a boundary. What a child was allowed to learn depended not on ability, but on purpose. And for a Roman girl, purpose was narrowly defined. Education existed to prepare boys for public life. For girls, it existed only insofar as it supported domestic roles. Most Roman girls received their education at home, if they received one at all. Their teachers were mothers, older female relatives, or enslaved women. Lessons were practical, repetitive, and constant. They learned how to manage a household, how to supervise servants, how to spin wool and weave cloth. These skills were celebrated as virtues. Roman literature frequently praised the woman at the loom, disciplined, productive, and silent. Learning was embodied, not intellectual. Upper-class girls sometimes learned to read and write. Some studied poetry, music, or basic arithmetic. But this education had limits. Reading was acceptable. Writing was tolerated. Argument was dangerous. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was the foundation of Roman power. It was taught to boys from an early age. Girls were excluded. To argue was to claim authority. Authority was not theirs to claim. A girl was not trained to speak in public, to defend herself in court, or to interpret the law. These were male domains. Knowledge of law, politics, and philosophy was considered unnecessary, even harmful, for women. A learned woman risked suspicion. Roman writers often portrayed educated women as unnatural or morally unstable. Too much knowledge was associated with sexual independence, defiance, or social disorder. The message was clear: a woman should know enough, but never too much. Education for girls focused on restraint. They were taught how to behave rather than how to think, how to obey rather than how to question, how to maintain harmony rather than how to challenge injustice. Silence was framed as wisdom. This absence of education was not accidental. It ensured dependence. Without legal knowledge, a woman could not navigate contracts. Without rhetorical training, she could not argue her case. Without philosophical grounding, she was discouraged from imagining alternatives. Ignorance became a form of control, and yet, despite these restrictions, some women learned anyway, through observation, through listening, through informal access to texts and conversations. In elite households, girls overheard political discussions. They memorized poetry. They learned languages indirectly. But this knowledge was unofficial, fragile, and often discouraged. It existed in the shadows. Education, for a Roman girl, was defined more by absence than presence, by what was withheld rather than what was taught. And as she approached puberty, even learning receded. Her body was becoming the focus. Her value was shifting. Soon, education would give way to preparation, not for life, but for marriage. In ancient Rome, puberty was not a private transformation. It was a public signal. For a Roman girl, the changes in her body did not belong to her. They belonged to her family, and soon to her future husband. There was no concept of adolescence as a protected stage of life. Childhood ended abruptly. The moment a girl's body showed signs of maturity, her status changed. She was no longer a child. She was a potential bride. This transition was not guided by comfort or understanding. It was governed by expectation and urgency. Menstruation, though rarely discussed openly, marked a critical turning point. It signaled fertility, and fertility was value. A girl's body became monitored. Her movements were further restricted. Contact with unrelated men was controlled. Her clothing became heavier, more concealing. Her behavior was scrutinized. Modesty was no longer symbolic. It was enforced. Roman society treated the female body as both fragile and dangerous. Fragile because it required protection. Dangerous because it could disrupt social order if uncontrolled. Desire, especially female desire, was something to be contained. Girls were not taught to understand their bodies. There was little explanation, little reassurance. Bodily changes were met with silence or discipline, not education. Pain, fear, and confusion were endured privately. Rituals accompanied this transition. In some households, a girl would dedicate her childhood toys to the household gods. This act symbolized the end of girlhood. Play was no longer appropriate. Her body was now functional. Marriage negotiations often accelerated at this stage. A girl might be engaged shortly after puberty, sometimes earlier. Age gaps were common. Men in their late 20s or older married girls barely in their teens. This was not considered cruel. It was considered normal. The logic was practical. A young bride was assumed to be more obedient, more fertile, and easier to shape. Her body was not prepared, but society did not care. Health risks were significant. Early pregnancy carried high rates of injury and death, but these dangers were rarely discussed. The value of reproduction outweighed concern for well-being. A Roman girl did not learn to own her body. She learned to manage it for others. Her posture, her clothing, her gaze, everything was regulated to preserve her worth. Virginity became a social obsession. It was not simply personal purity. It was a family asset. A girl's sexual status affected alliances, dowries, and reputation. Violation, whether through coercion or rumor, could destroy her future. And yet, the burden of responsibility fell entirely on her. Roman law and culture focused on female chastity, not male restraint. By the time puberty ended, a Roman girl had internalized a profound truth. Her body was no longer hers. It was a site of exchange, a source of anxiety, a symbol of honor, and very soon it would be transferred from her father's household to her husband's bed. Marriage was no longer approaching. It was inevitable. In ancient Rome, marriage was not a milestone. It was a transfer. For a Roman girl, marriage did not represent adulthood chosen. It represented adulthood imposed. By the time she was married, her fate had already been negotiated. Marriage arrangements were made by men. Fathers, guardians, and male relatives discussed alliances, status, and advantage. The girl herself was rarely present. Her opinion was not required. Consent existed in theory. In practice, silence was consent. A girl could be promised in marriage years before the ceremony. Engagements were legal and binding. Breaking them brought shame and legal consequences, not for the girl, but for her family. Marriage age for girls was shockingly young by modern standards. 12 to 14 was common. Some were married even earlier. The age difference between bride and groom was often significant. This imbalance was intentional. A young bride was expected to adapt, to obey, and to learn quickly. Her inexperience was seen as an advantage. The wedding itself was not romantic. It was ritualistic and symbolic. On the night before her wedding, the girl dedicated her childhood belongings, dolls, toys, simple ornaments, to the household gods. This act marked the official end of her girlhood. She did not transition gradually. She was taken. On the wedding day, she wore a special tunic tied with a symbolic knot, meant to represent virginity. Her hair was arranged in a traditional style, recalling archaic rituals of capture. The symbolism was clear. She was being removed from one household and absorbed into another. During the ceremony, she was led, not invited, into marriage. At the threshold of her new home, she was lifted over the doorway. This gesture symbolized both protection and possession. Her body crossed a boundary she could not return from. Marriage in Rome came in different legal forms, but the outcome was similar. A woman was always under male authority, whether her husband's or her father's. Her primary obligations were obedience, fidelity, and reproduction. Love was not the foundation. Duty was. The wedding night was not discussed publicly. It was assumed. A girl who had never been educated about her body was expected to perform her role without question. Fear was irrelevant. Pain was normalized. Silence continued. Once married, she was expected to adapt quickly, to manage a household, to produce children, to reflect honor upon her husband's family. Failure was punished. Infertility was blamed on the woman. Miscarriage was endured privately. Stillbirths were mourned quietly. Marriage did not guarantee security. A husband could divorce his wife easily. Adultery laws punished women far more harshly than men. A woman's reputation remained fragile even within marriage. And yet, divorce did not mean freedom. A divorced woman often returned to her father's authority or became dependent on male relatives. Independence was rare. Marriage was not a destination. It was a condition that defined a Roman woman's life from adolescence until death. For the girl who once played in the household shadows, marriage marked the final loss of choice. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life, and now she belonged elsewhere. Marriage did not bring rest. It brought responsibility. Inside the Roman household, a woman's world expanded in duty, but not in power. The home was considered her domain, yet it did not belong to her. A Roman wife was expected to manage the household with efficiency and restraint. This included supervising servants and slaves, organizing food supplies, overseeing textile production, and maintaining order. These tasks were not optional. They were moral obligations. A well-run household reflected the virtue of the woman who managed it. Disorder was seen as a personal failure. Yet despite her central role, she remained legally dependent. Major decisions, finances, property, legal matters, were made by men. Her authority was practical, not formal. She worked constantly, often from early morning until night. Spinning and weaving were daily activities, even for elite women. These tasks symbolized discipline and modesty. Roman culture idealized the image of the wife at the loom, productive, quiet, and loyal. Her labor sustained the household. Her silence sustained the hierarchy. The household itself was not private in the modern sense. Roman homes were filled with movement, family members, enslaved people, clients, visitors. Privacy was rare. A woman's behavior was always observed. Her speech, her gestures, her interactions were monitored, not necessarily by her husband alone, but by the entire household. Reputation lived inside the walls. A wife was expected to embody patria, modesty, chastity, self-control. This virtue is praised endlessly in Roman texts and funerary inscriptions. A good woman was described as faithful, obedient, hardworking, and quiet. Rarely was she described as happy. Motherhood soon followed. Pregnancy was expected early and often. Producing children, especially sons, was a wife's most important role. A woman who failed to conceive faced suspicion and blame. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth remained one of the leading causes of death for Roman women. There was little medical understanding, and pain was accepted as inevitable. A woman might give birth many times. She might lose many children. Grief was private. Endurance was praised. If she succeeded, if she bore sons, her status improved. A mother of male heirs was respected. Her position within the household became more secure, but this security was fragile. A husband could still divorce her. He could take another wife. He could accuse her of adultery, a crime punished far more harshly for women than for men. Fidelity was demanded from her, not from him. Despite this imbalance, many women developed forms of quiet power. They influenced household decisions indirectly. They formed alliances with servants and relatives. They shaped the next generation through upbringing. Their influence was subtle, informal, and undocumented. History rarely noticed them. Life inside the Roman household was a life of constant negotiation between obedience and agency, duty and survival. A woman learned to navigate power without appearing to challenge it. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to endure. And as the years passed, her body changed again. Youth faded, fertility declined. And with age came a different kind of visibility and a different kind of vulnerability. In ancient Rome, motherhood was not a choice. It was an obligation. For a Roman woman, her value within marriage was measured above all by her ability to produce children, preferably sons. Motherhood was praised in public language but endured in private reality. Pregnancy was expected early. A wife was often pregnant soon after marriage, sometimes while her body was still developing. There was no concept of spacing births for health. A woman's body was expected to recover quickly and to repeat the process again and again. Roman medicine offered little protection. Midwives relied on experience, herbal remedies, and ritual. Complications were common: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor. These risks were accepted as normal. Pain was not treated. Death was not rare. Many Roman women did not survive childbirth. Those who did often carried long-term injuries. Yet these outcomes were rarely recorded. Death in childbirth was considered a tragic but expected part of womanhood. The emotional toll was equally severe. Infant mortality was high. Many babies died within days or months. Mothers learned not to become too attached too quickly, not because they did not care, but because grief was constant. Loss was normalized. A woman might give birth to 6 or 7 children and bury half of them. Public mourning was limited. Excessive grief was discouraged. Strength and restraint were praised as feminine virtues. A mother was expected to endure silently. Sons brought security. A woman who bore male heirs gained respect within the household. Her status improved. Her voice, though still limited, carried more weight. Daughters did not bring the same protection. A woman who bore only daughters could be pitied or blamed. Infertility was almost always attributed to the woman. Remedies focused on her body. Male infertility was rarely acknowledged. Failure to conceive could lead to divorce, abandonment, or replacement. Motherhood also brought legal and social expectations. A mother was responsible for raising children in accordance with Roman values. She shaped future citizens, but without recognition. Her labor was essential, yet invisible. Even in moments of joy, a child's first steps, first words, she remained secondary. The child legally belonged to the father. Her bond was emotional, not legal. And still, motherhood was often the closest a Roman woman came to power. Through her children, she influenced the future. She taught values, habits, and loyalty. She formed alliances through marriage negotiations. Her identity became relational. She was no longer just a wife. She was a mother. But even this role had limits. If her children died, her status weakened. If her husband died, her security was uncertain. If her sons grew and left, she could be left behind. Motherhood was not a guarantee. It was a risk repeated again and again. And as time passed, another transformation awaited: aging, the fading of fertility, and with it, the question of what remained when a Roman woman's primary value was gone. In ancient Rome, womanhood was not experienced equally. For some women, oppression was layered. Class did not erase gender inequality, it intensified it. Enslaved women lived at the lowest rung of Roman society. They were not recognized as persons under the law, but as property. Their bodies belonged entirely to their owners. For an enslaved girl, birth carried no protection. She could be sold, punished, or exploited without legal consequence. Her labor was constant. Her consent was irrelevant. Sexual violence against enslaved women was not considered a crime. It was a right of ownership. An enslaved woman could not refuse, could not accuse, could not seek justice. Pregnancy brought no security. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status. They became property at birth. A woman could watch her children sold away, separated permanently without recourse. Motherhood under slavery was not honored. It was exploited. Domestic enslaved women served Roman households closely. They cleaned, cooked, raised children, and were constantly visible, yet never seen. Their proximity to power made them vulnerable. They absorbed the emotional burdens of the household, while carrying none of its protections. Freed women, formerly enslaved women who gained freedom, lived in a liminal space. They were no longer property, but they were not fully autonomous. A freed woman remained tied to her former owner through legal obligations. Her freedom was conditional. Marriage was possible, but status was fragile. Her past marked her. Social mobility existed, but only narrowly. Even freeborn women from poor families faced severe limitations. They worked outside the home, in markets, workshops, farms. Their labor was necessary for survival. Respectability was harder to maintain. Exposure to violence was greater. Protection was weaker. For these women, invisibility was not an option. They were visible and vulnerable. The idealized image of the modest Roman matron applied mainly to elite women. For the majority, survival required constant negotiation between labor and danger. Gender oppression existed across all classes. But for enslaved and poor women, there was no illusion of honor to soften it. Their lives left few records. Their suffering left no monuments. Yet they were the backbone of Roman society. They cleaned its homes, raised its children, sustained its economy. Their bodies bore the weight of empire more directly than any senator or general. And still, their stories are largely silent. As a Roman woman aged, regardless of class, another transformation occurred. Youth passed. fertility declined, and society's gaze shifted once more. In ancient Rome, power was rarely given to women. When it was, it came at a cost. Religion was one of the few spaces where women could hold visible authority. Yet even here, autonomy was tightly controlled. Most Roman women participated in religion as worshippers, not leaders. They prayed, made offerings, and upheld household rituals. Religion reinforced their roles rather than challenged them. But there were exceptions. The most famous were the Vestal Virgins. Chosen as young girls, often between the ages of 6 and 10, Vestals were removed from their families and placed under state control. They served the goddess Vesta, guardian of the sacred hearth of Rome. Their duty was to maintain the eternal flame, a symbol of the city's survival. In return, Vestals received privileges denied to other women. They were legally independent. They could own property. They could make wills. They were freed from male guardianship. In public, they were honored. They held seats of distinction at events. Their presence could pardon condemned prisoners. Yet this freedom was conditional. Their power rested entirely on one requirement: sexual purity. A Vestal who broke her vow of virginity committed a crime not against morality, but against the state. The punishment was death. Execution methods were designed to avoid spilling sacred blood. A condemned Vestal was buried, alive in an underground chamber and sealed, away with minimal provisions. The severity of this punishment reveals the truth behind the privilege. Autonomy was allowed only if the female body was fully controlled. Other religious roles existed: priestesses of certain cults, participants in mystery religions, but these two operated within boundaries. Women could serve gods but not govern men. Religion provided visibility, not equality. It offered reverence, not freedom. Even celebrated women remained symbolic rather than autonomous. Outside of religion, Roman culture occasionally praised exceptional women: loyal wives, devoted mothers, women who sacrificed themselves for family honor. But these stories reinforced norms rather than broke them. Exceptional women were admired only when they upheld the system. A woman who challenged authority, sought independence, or disrupted hierarchy was viewed with suspicion or fear. True autonomy remained rare. For the majority of women, aging marked another shift. Youth had made them valuable. Fertility had defined their worth. What happened when both faded? In ancient Rome, the law spoke loudly, but it did not speak to women. Roman law was written by men, interpreted by men, and enforced in male-dominated spaces. For women, it functioned as a framework of limits rather than protection. A Roman woman was rarely recognized as a full legal person. Most lived under tutela, male guardianship. A father, husband, or male relative legally represented her in contracts, court proceedings, and financial matters. Even wealthy women often required a guardian's approval to act. Her voice existed, but only through another man. Women could not vote. They could not hold public office. They could not serve in the military. These exclusions were not debated. They were assumed. The law defined women as inherently dependent emotionally, intellectually, and morally. Independence was seen as a threat to social order. Testimony by women in court was limited and often considered unreliable. A woman's word carried less weight than a man's, regardless of truth. Violence against women was not clearly defined as a crime. Domestic abuse was considered a private matter. Sexual violence laws focused on property and honor rather than consent. A woman's body was protected only insofar as it belonged to another man. If a woman was assaulted, the injury was framed as damage to her father's or husband's authority, not as harm to her. Silence was built into the system. A woman could not easily accuse. She could not easily defend. She could not easily escape. Marriage contracts reinforced inequality. Dowries were controlled by male relatives. Divorce favored men. Custody of children belonged to fathers. Even when women gained limited legal independence later in the empire, social norms continued to restrict them. Law and culture worked together. One defined boundaries, the other enforced them. A Roman woman learned that justice was not designed for her. Compliance offered safety. Resistance brought risk. As she aged, her legal invisibility deepened. Without fertility, without youth, without a husband or father, a woman could become socially marginal. And yet some women resisted in quiet ways. They negotiated. They endured. They survived. But survival is not the same as agency, and violence, unnamed, unrecorded, remained part of the landscape. In ancient Rome, violence against women did not always leave marks. Often it left silence. There was no single word for what many women endured, no clear legal category, no shared language that named their suffering. Violence existed, but it was normalized. Inside the household, a husband held disciplinary authority over his wife. What constituted discipline was loosely defined. Physical punishment, confinement, and humiliation were often treated as private matters. The law rarely intervened. A woman was expected to endure. Endurance was praised as virtue. Sexual violence was framed not through consent, but through ownership. If a woman was assaulted, the legal concern was whose authority had been violated, her father's, her husband's, or her owner's. Her own experience was secondary. For enslaved women, violence required no justification at all. Their bodies were legally accessible. Refusal had no meaning. Rape within slavery was invisible because it was not considered a crime. Even free women faced profound barriers to justice. Accusations were dangerous. A woman who spoke risked disbelief, social ruin, or punishment. Silence offered protection. Speech invited danger. Violence also took subtler forms: forced marriages, early pregnancies, denial of education, restriction of movement. These were not seen as violence. They were seen as order. A Roman girl learned early that pain did not require explanation, and that resistance had consequences. Medical texts of the period discuss women's bodies clinically, often blaming women for their own suffering. Emotional pain was ignored entirely. Trauma had no name. What modern audiences might recognize as abuse was absorbed into daily life. It shaped behavior, posture, silence. Yet Roman women were not passive victims. They adapted. They learned how to anticipate moods, how to avoid conflict, how to protect themselves and their children within narrow margins. Survival required constant vigilance. Violence was not an interruption of life. It was part of its structure. And as women aged, the form of violence shifted from physical control to neglect, from scrutiny to erasure. The body that had once been monitored became irrelevant, and with that irrelevance came another kind of danger. In ancient Rome, youth was value. For women, it was often their only recognized value. As a Roman woman aged, her position shifted once again. Fertility declined. Beauty faded by societal standards, and with them, attention moved elsewhere. Aging did not bring authority in the way it sometimes did for men. It brought invisibility. An older woman no longer served the primary functions expected of her: marriageability and childbirth. Without these, her social worth diminished. If she had sons, especially adult sons, her position could remain stable. A mother of grown men was respected, protected, and sometimes consulted. But this respect was conditional. It depended on male relatives. A widow with sons might live securely within their households. A widow without sons faced uncertainty. She could become dependent on distant kin, charity, or labor. There was no social safety net. Older women often lived on the margins of households, present, useful but unseen. They cared for grandchildren, managed domestic routines, or performed religious duties. Their labor continued. Recognition did not. Physical vulnerability increased with age. Illness, disability, and poverty were common. Medical care was limited and uneven. An aging woman's body, once controlled and monitored, became neglected. Neglect was its own form of violence. Cultural attitudes toward older women were often harsh. Roman literature sometimes portrayed them as burdensome, bitter, or manipulative. Wisdom was rarely attributed to them. Unlike male elders whose age conferred authority, female elders were tolerated rather than respected. Yet aging also brought small freedoms. Sexual scrutiny lessened. Expectations softened slightly. Some older women spoke more openly, moved more freely within limited spaces. Invisibility could create room to breathe, but it was not liberation. It was the absence of interest. For many women, aging meant being forgotten while still alive. Their contributions, decades of labor, childbirth, endurance, were not commemorated. Their names faded. Their stories disappeared. And when death came, it rarely marked the end of public significance. Roman women were rarely memorialized for who they were, only for who they were to others. In ancient Rome, death did not equal remembrance. For most women, it marked disappearance. Roman society commemorated power. It carved the names of men into stone, generals, senators, emperors. Women, when remembered at all, were remembered in relation to others. Daughter of, wife of, mother of, rarely as themselves. A woman's death was usually quiet. There were rituals, yes, mourning practices, funerary procession, but public recognition was limited. Gravestones for women often followed a pattern. They praised obedience, modesty, loyalty, fertility. They rarely mentioned thoughts, achievements, or individuality. She was chaste. She was faithful. She managed the household well. These were considered complete lives. Death in childbirth was common enough to be expected. Many women died young, leaving behind children who barely remembered them. Their absence was absorbed into normal life. There were no monuments for endurance. Even wealthy women were often reduced to idealized virtues. Their real experiences, fear, pain, desire, resistance, did not survive in stone. Poor women and enslaved women left almost no trace at all. No inscriptions, no records, no names. Their deaths passed unnoticed beyond immediate necessity. Rome was a civilization obsessed with legacy, but legacy was selective. Women carried the empire biologically, emotionally, domestically, yet history recorded them minimally. This erasure was not accidental. Remembering women as individuals would have disrupted the narrative. Rome told about itself, an empire of order, of hierarchy, of control. Silence after death mirrored silence in life. And yet fragments remain: a scratched name on a tomb, a dedication from a grieving husband, a child's mention of a mother long gone. These fragments hint at lives fully lived, though never fully acknowledged. To study Roman women is to read between lines written by others, to imagine what was never recorded, and to recognize that absence itself is historical evidence. History often presents itself as complete. Names, dates, laws, victories. But history is also defined by what it excludes. In ancient Rome, women were not absent because they did nothing. They were absent because what they did was not considered worth recording. The girl born into Rome lived a life shaped by restriction, expectation, and endurance. She moved through roles assigned to her long before she understood them. Daughter, bride, wife, mother. At every stage, her body was regulated. Her voice was limited. Her choices were negotiated by others, and yet Rome could not have existed without her. Empires do not survive on conquest alone. They survive on daily labor, emotional resilience, reproduction, and care, work overwhelmingly performed by women. Roman women held families together, raised future citizens, maintained households that allowed public life to function. Their labor was foundational and uncredited. When we study Rome without its women, we misunderstand Rome itself. This is not a story of victimhood alone. It is a story of adaptation, of intelligence used quietly, of strength exercised invisibly, of survival without recognition. Roman women were not passive. They learned to navigate power in indirect ways. They protected their children. They influenced households. They endured structures designed to limit them. Their resistance was rarely dramatic. It was persistent. The absence of women's voices in historical records is not proof of their silence. It is proof of exclusion. To recover their stories, we must ask different questions, read between lines, pay attention to omissions, and when we do, a fuller picture of the ancient world emerges, one that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and whose lives are deemed worthy of memory. The Roman girl whose life we followed in this story did not change history, but history was built on her life. Understanding her fate is not about judging the past. It is about recognizing how deeply structures of inequality are rooted and how long their shadows extend. Because history is not only what happened, it is what was allowed to be remembered. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that survived only in silence.